Greetings, ladies and managers, and welcome to this narration of the web series The Lost Terran. If you are new to the series, there is a playlist listed in the description, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 15. After several rounds of Rix teaching Munter Syrian chess and attempting one or two other games, Rix wandered back to his bunk, intent on grabbing some sleep. The Predator drive continued to steadily count down. If Rix's estimates to be 1 to 10 time dilation between real space and wherever jump space was, then approximately 60 days would have passed externally. Munter was having a hard time coping with the almost frustrating lack of inputs, between the blankness external to the Esperanto and the not being connected to the networks. Munter hadn't realized how much they had come to rely on those networks. They wanted to have the networks back, but Munter hadn't really thought about it, but they would turn their senses in the direction of where they had been. The docking clamps were all that remained as evidence that their body had gotten left behind. It hurt Munter in a way that wasn't quantifiable or logical. Munter was still intact after all. A visit to the manufactory, and they could get readily installed into a proper self again, not this antique made for organics. Begrudgingly, Munter did have to admit that the Esperanto was more than just an antique. The jump drive alone would be worth researching. It most likely was a heavily superseded technology, but a technology which permitted longer distance FTL and did not rely on charging of strange matter would be worth considering. The cargo hold was still something of a mystery to Munter. There did not appear to be a specific manifest within the system, and Munter had not yet made a point of asking Rix what the vessel contained. Based on Rix's description, it could be anything, from equipment to seats, and even mass stasis chambers holding animals or even Terrans. As the Terran hadn't mentioned the cargo hold much in detail, it was possibly that they didn't know. Alternatively, it was possible that because there wasn't Terrans in stasis or anything particularly use in the moment, Rix had considered it not worthy of taking out of stasis. Following that logic, Munter decided that whatever it was must be live or some version of it to warrant such massive stasis fields. As Rix slept, Munter even trundled the walking frame down to the narrow doors that entered into the cargo chamber. A small window provided a glance in using the eyes on a stick that the walking frame had in Rix's phrasing. But nothing of consequence was visible, just a slow glow of stasis fields. A substantial analog pad sat on one side of the door, labeled still, denoting its control of the stasis system beyond. Something that was curious was that the controls for the pad were locked via a loop of metal embedded into another. Munter presumed that this was intended to prevent unintentional deactivation of the stasis field, but found it to be an odd all the same. Still, spinning ideas as to what the Terran was carrying and doing their level best to cope with the low inputs, Munter trundled the walking frame back to the galley and began running soft diagnostics. Rix did not go straight to sleep, but instead read from the scroll for a bit. In the abbreviated form of galactic history and the current state of galactic society that Munter had provided, Terran involvement, while stated in a singular line, was almost avoided altogether. Additionally, sapience and sentience appeared to be deliberately intermingled, making Rix wonder if Munter had made a translation error, or if in fact the metrics were considered one and the same, at least the context of the Galactic Society. Galactic governance had been founded and set about uplifting various species as FTL systems known as the Achilles were promulgated. In the early years of the Galactic Society, as the Tassets and the various species, then numbering less than 10 of full sapient ranking, were still coming to terms with one another, and lexicons were formed, conflicts still occurred. There were no outright wars between the species as far as they were described in history, merely conflicts between a few desperate vessels, stations, and even colonies. The majority of these were resolved by diplomatic means, although very little was stated as to why this was the case or why this was accepted. Uplifting continued as the species and their societies moved into the stars and found more species to bring into the stars. There had been debates about permitting species to reach such technological points by themselves, arguments that species might not manage to overcome the various great filters by themselves, and even arguments on economic basis that while these species should have control of their home planet, any other resource in the system should be considered fair game to the galactic community. There had been strong pushback against each of these arguments, and eventually the Concord of Species Self-Determinism was charted and signed by every full sentient. In this document, it was clearly stated that the species had to reach certain technological points before hints of first contact could be made. Species were also given the responsibility of overcoming the great filters on their own unless they petitioned for help from the galactic community, noting, of course, that social and biological great filters had to be addressed internally. Species were also granted the standoff with the whole of their systems to the edge of the heliosphere as definitively their territory, once they had observed to be making technological progress, supporting a full sentient rating. There were still arguments that this made a case for explorers and enterprising groups to keep quiet about any species they did encounter, as well as rating levels of sentience, and this was considered a subject of internal debate by galactic governance. The current rating levels for sentience, to Rick's surprise, would actually place the old Terran crows at mid-sentience, due to their tool usage, and a pet like Reggie to full sentience, as Reggie was able to communicate, albeit obtusely, outside of his species. Rix found this to be especially generous, but understood the described argument that such a system should fail upward, so as to not support inadvertent first contacts and even species exploitation. It did make him wonder what manner of species were out there that were considered mid-sentience to such a point that others would argue for their elevation to full sentience. Rix could see the argument in favor of downgrading the system to being less generous, but was suspicious of it all the same. In the last 800-odd years, galactic society had swelled from a paltry few full sentience to 74 full sentience, 34 of which were most active in the galactic society. Only about a third of them were active in the galactic society were even vaguely bipedal, the majority of the rest being quadrupedal. There were obvious outliers, but, on the whole, pedal locomotion was the rule. One outlier was a species known as the Dragzoon, the name losing something in the translation, Rix decided. The Dragzoon were a species of hardened flesh around a mixture of gases, their world having been rich in nutrients for these species who could leave the ground. The Dragzoon had come to produce and capture various gases which allowed them to float/fly in ways that weren't captured in this abbreviated status of galactic society. The Dragzoon were in fact an ignorant species, but one that had entirely independently managed void flight and even basic FTL before having found/been found by galactic explorers. There had been some conflicts as a result, but the Dragzoon had eventually settled into galactic society peacefully enough. What surprised Rix most was how none of the Xeno species appeared Terran at all. As far as he was following, not an insignificant number of these were supposed to have been uplifted to a certain degree by Terrans, and yet none of them looked even remotely like a Terran. The closest thing to looking like a Terran had been 4 arms and a third leg, a Plinx. Switch back to the main body of history, Rix continued reading. Other than exploration, economic debates, negotiations of species, and related void-based galactic society dialogues, galactic society had been, in Rix's opinion, exceptionally quiet. There had been virtually no wars, at least none in Rix's way of thinking. This lack of conflict seemed worrying, like a kind of eraser having been taken through the history and eliminating all the parts that were less desirable. Rix made a mental note to ask Munter about interstellar warfare, a galactic society that had perfectly come together without interspecies warfare. Maybe he was a cynic, but he found it difficult to believe. Rix dozed off at this point, the words starting to jumble before his eyes and the auto-dim feature on the scroll darkening as his fingers fell away from it. The following morning, Munter was feeling almost anxious as Rix walked into the galley. "Good morning, Rix," Munter cleanly enunciated, having spent some additional time with the lexicon that night. Mumbled Rix, tabbing up a steaming container of coffee. "Did your rest cycle complete successfully?" Munter, Walking's frame, tried flashing a series of emotional runes. Rix sat down, glanced over blankly at the Walking Frame's runes, and turned back to his coffee. The pair sat in silence for a bit, with only the hum of the ship around them. Rix didn't say anything for a full 15 minutes as he slowly drank his coffee. "So, what's with those flashy symbols?" Rix asked, eventually breaking the silence. "They represent emotional context of words, as I am unable to equivocate body language, luminescence, pheromones, and/or ready tone between languages," Munter said. "So, when you're talking, you normally use those to indicate how you're feeling about what you're saying," Rix said, standing and ordering another container of coffee and a bowl which apparently contained the Terran's breakfast. "That is the correct interpretation, yes. It is necessary function of tacit translators between organic languages and galactic standard," Munter said. "So, tell me, how are you feeling?" Rix seemed to smile at this, although Munter was uncertain as to why. Munter reflexively flashed several rooms. Ah. Use your words, Em. I don't read runes. Not yet, at any rate. Rix waved a finger at the walking frame. I'm experiencing some issues with being disconnected from myself and from my network, Munter managed. Withdraw, or is it something that I need to go down to your core to fiddle with? Rix pulled a long piece of what looked like meat that Munter had printed previously from the bowl and proceeded to crunch his way through it. I do not believe there is an external means of correcting this without additional inputs, Munter said, flashing the runes reflexively still. So withdraw. I can work with that. We just have to keep each other occupied is all. I'm sure that we can come up with plenty between the two of us. Rix nodded some and pulled out another piece of crunchy meat. Munter was uncertain about this, and it showed in the runes, not bothering to filter them in his moment. But it had felt good to say something to the Terran. Did you take a rest cycle? A dream function or some means of offlining your internal systems can catch up on everything that is happening? Rix asked, taking a long swig of his coffee. I have not, but I believe that is a function that I have in my system, Munter said, looking at the virtual button within. Have you never needed to use it? Rix seemed somewhat surprised. Munter considered whether the Terran would consider using runes at some point. It would take interpretation on the Terran's words much simpler, even in the face of the dated lexicon. I have not. I am optimized for continuous operation, Munter said, flashing a rune for pride. Rix glanced at the rune and frowned. Everybody needs offline time, even if it's just to gather themselves. I know you're, artificial and all, but I have a hard time believing that you've never taken some offline time, even when visiting some place for maintenance. Rix's face screwed up a bit. I have briefly offlined during major maintenance approximately 45 years ago, but that was the last time on record, Munter said. Well, I'm going to go ahead and say that you need to start going to sleep when I do, Rix said, continuing to pick at the contents of his bowl, various blobs finding their way into his mouth. I do not agree. What will happen to this ship? Munter asked. We're in jump space. Until we get out of it, there's very little we can do, unless we crash out again, and I'd really rather that not happen. Rix gestured vaguely to the room and the ship around them with a piece of food. The question still stands, Munter replied. Rix appeared to give some thought. Set an alarm, Rix said. Please clarify the statement. Set an alarm. Make it so that some automatic processes that just watch the ship for the both of us. Doesn't have to be anything too big or important. Just watch the dials and let us know if something happens, Rix said, filling his mouth with the last of the contents of the bowl. There was a logic in this. Munter wasn't entirely certain as to where the Terran was going with this, but it was not on the unreasonable suggestion. Finishing off the second cup of coffee, Rix picked up the walking frame, a feat that made the Terran grunt audibly in the heavy gravity and galley, and he sat on the opposing bench from where Rix had been seated for his meal. Now, I'm going to teach you Talus Poker, Rix said, folding the scroll in such a way as the half screen was obscured and the other half was facing the walking frame. Munter reflexively flashed a rune for obligatory acknowledgement, their questions able to wait until later. End of chapter. I would quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and Patreons. Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Lord Azrekahl, Dragzoon W.R.E, Holly's sister, Arcadian. Thank you very much.